Attention, you're listening to The Todd Huff Show, America's home for conservative, not bitter talk and education. Be advised, the content of this program has been documented to prevent and even cure liberalism, and listening may cause you to lean to the right. And now, coming to you from the Full Suite Wealth Studios, here's your conservative but not bitter host, Todd Huff.
Did the Supreme Court get it right yesterday, my friends? That's what we're going to talk about. Two of these Supreme Court cases where they issued rulings yesterday. One of those rulings, of course, was concerning birthright citizenship. The other that we're going to talk about is a ruling on whether or not states can put limitations on transgender participation in high school sports. We'll talk about those. We'll maybe get into some other things as well. By the way, we're relaunching. We took a 2-month pause on the Inner Circle newsletter. We've restructured. I spent some time developing, growing our social reach, and we've had a lot of success. Believe it or not, by the grace of God, we have had several million people reached on social media. Our primary channels now are Facebook and Instagram. I invite you to follow us there if you haven't. It's an entertaining, place to be with some of these comments and delusional things that I run into each and every day on Facebook and Instagram. But if you're interested in getting, the story behind the story, being part of the conversation, the Inner Circle is where we elaborate and build upon some things. We get to things that we haven't been able to discuss on the program, sometimes go into them in more depth. In the Inner Circle, it's a daily newsletter that'll go out. It's going to be relaunching here in a couple of days, maybe early next week at this particular point, but we're close to relaunching, close enough to me for me to tell you that you can text the word JOIN to 317-785-1030 if you want to be to subscribe to that, and we'll get you signed up. You can also, if you prefer, go to innercircle.toddhuffshow.com and sign up there. Just put your email in and you can be added to that as well. That's where the real kind of conversation exists, and there's some bonuses and some things that we can't get to on this program. But let's talk about the Supreme Court today, my friends. I want to remind you too, as we get started here, we've got a partnership with MyPillow. MyPillow has been a part of the Todd Huff Show now for, I want to say, it's been a couple of years. It's been at least 3 years. And, when we first partnered, we first discussed partnership, I knew about the pillows. I knew about the slippers. I didn't know about some of the other things. I didn't know about the sheets and the towels and other items. We have a dog bed for our trio of dogs, Tango, Echo, and Kilo. I should tell you some stories about the dogs, but I won't. But MyPillow has a wide variety of products that's made right here in the good old US of A, a patriotic company. Founder loves America. The founder, Mike Lindell, is now running even for governor in the state of Minnesota. And you can get discounts if you use my name, Todd, during the checkout process. MyPillow.com, you can go and shop the products there and even shop those things just to see what they've got. They've got, again, a wide variety of high-quality products. We use them. I know many of you use them, and for those of you who don't, or maybe you need a new pillow, maybe you need some new towels, I encourage you to check out MyPillow.com. Promo code Todd will get you discounts there, again, at MyPillow.com. Let's talk about the Supreme Court case. Two of them from yesterday that the decisions were released. Now, this wraps up all the cases that were before the court on this particular docket have been released now. But let's start with the case involving birthright citizenship. So you know this, or maybe we just need to have a quick refresher, but you know that President Donald J. Trump issued an executive order an executive order saying that birthright citizenship is not meant to be applied to people who are in this country illegally or who are not here permanently. So what happens, as you well know, is that there is a race for people to find a way to get their feet into the United States of America and have a child while here. There's terms to describe this. There are terms like anchor babies, because if a baby is a U.S. citizen, so if you sneak into this country illegally, if you overstay a visa, things like that, you're here illegally or you're not here permanently, you have a child. That child, it's always been interpreted according to the interpretation of the Constitution and federal statute that the child is a U.S. citizen. And of course, if you have a child who's a U.S. citizen, it anchors you to the United States of America. Now, I've been clear on this from the very beginning, as I am with everything else, of course, too, my friends, but I understand why people want to come to the United States of America. I get it. I understand it. This is the greatest nation on the face of the earth. And as Rush Limbaugh used to say, as I have said as well, it is not because we are genetically superior. It is not because we are something special. The reason for this is that we put into practice, put into place some very fundamental ideals that unleashed the potential of average, everyday people. We established a nation, as I've said before. We're approaching today's the first day of July, by the way. We're going to be celebrating our 250th birthday here as Americans in just a few short days, 3 days from now on Saturday. Of course, it happens on the weekend, which makes this even better, but we'll talk about this in more detail even on Friday. But as America approaches her 250th birthday, it's a good thing for us to take note, take inventory of just how special this place is. This place is special. It's not what these leftists out there tell us that it is. In fact, I see some of these man-on-the-street interviews, some of these folks who go to college campuses, who attend some leftist rallies and so forth, and they ask people. I saw one person ask someone at a LGBT event, are you more proud of the LGBT flag or of the American flag? And she was almost bothered that the question even had to be asked. She said, obviously, the LGBT flag. And I know that's not the full acronym, the LGBTQIA plus, whatever the heck it is now, flag. That's what she said she was more proud. And obviously, she's not proud to be American. There is a group of Americans, young Americans, even Americans who are in my generation, Generation X, my friends. Don't let anyone tell you I'm a millennial. No. I am not a millennial. I think I would kick my own butt if I was a millennial. But I'm a Generation Xer. I'm at the tail end of Gen X, but I'm a Gen Xer. And there are people in my generation who hate this country as well. I find that, crazy, but I also find it fascinating that you could have grown up in the world that I grew up in and come to the conclusion that this is a bad place. It's wild to me, but this is how people think. This is what they believe and so forth. But if you listen, and this is the point, if you listen to the people on the left describe this country, there would be no reason for anyone in the world to want to come here because this place is called racist and bigoted and homophobic, anti-women, and all this sort of stuff. But yet people want to come here. They want to come here so bad, in fact, that they'll do virtually whatever they can to get across that border. Now, I'm not condoning that. That can't be done. That is breaking the law. There should be consequences for that. If you've done that, you are absolutely justified. It is absolutely justified that you are deported. What Trump is doing with deportations is absolutely within the confines of the law and is absolutely justifiable. If you don't like the law, you can try to change it, but this is the law, my friends. If you're here illegally, you can be deported. You can be removed from this country. In fact, that is the prescription for the crime. That's exactly what should happen. I'm not here doing what the left often does. For example, they hate Donald Trump so much, they want him out of the White House. They would love to see him in an orange jumpsuit. They would love to see him in the clink, but they can't, of course, find him there. But they will justify anything whatsoever to get that desired result. That's not how I approach illegal immigration. I look at the law. I see that we have laws in the books that say you're not supposed to be here without going through a certain process. If you didn't go through that process and they get you, ICE detains you and checks to see if you're legally here, and you're not, you can be deported. That's how this works. That's how this works, my friends. And so, but it's puzzling to me why people who hate this country as founded, who only say terrible things about this, who blame America first, how they constantly find a way to I guess even remotely understand why people want to come here. Because if America is as bad as they tell us, why would people want to do these things to begin with? But birth tourism is a thing. Anchor babies are a thing. And so Trump wrote an executive order saying that birthright citizenship was not going to be applied to people who were here illegally or who were not here permanently. And so eventually, of course, there's lawsuits that result from this. This goes to the Supreme Court. The court released this decision yesterday, and they ruled against Trump 6-3. Now, this is a little bit confusing. Because so in one respect, it was a 5-4 vote. In another respect, it was a 6-3 vote. Let me explain really quickly. There were when it came to the issue of whether or not Trump's executive order was legal, just overall legal, the court ruled 6-3 that it was not. There is a difference, however, regarding how one of those justices viewed it. 5 of the justices said that it went against the Constitution's 14th Amendment, and we're going to get into this. But one of the justices, and by the way, those 5, let me just name them. You know 3 of them, Elena Kagan, Sonia Sotomayor, Ketanji Brown Jackson. The other 2 were Amy Coney Barrett and John Roberts. So those were the 5 who voted to say that Trump's executive order violated the 14th Amendment specifically. One more justice, Brett Kavanaugh, said it did not violate the 14th Amendment. It violated federal statute, and an executive order cannot be written to overcome or to override a federal statute. He would be right in that respect, assuming that, of course, the question at hand is whether or not. Again, I'm not speaking about the law in particular. I'm talking about the 14th Amendment. So Kavanaugh's kind of in the middle, but he still ultimately decided that Trump could not do this. The 3 justices who said that this did not violate the 14th Amendment were Samuel Alito, Justice Clarence Thomas, and Neil Gorsuch, the originalists on the Supreme Court. These are the people who are actually committed to interpreting the Constitution as written, as intended. These are champions for the Constitution. You know, one way of looking at our system of government is to say technically in the historical sense of how government was framed, you had Congress. The House of Representatives was designed to represent the people, right? The individual voter. The senators, because at one point in time they were elected by state legislatures, they represented the states. That's since been changed because now we vote directly both for senators and for members of the House of Representatives. I hate that, by the way. I wish that had never been changed, but that's water under the bridge. And then, of course, there's the Supreme Court in this particular instance, where the Supreme Court is representing the Constitution. They're the voice of the Constitution, the voice of federal statutes. That's why, by the way, we should never care what the personal opinions are. I mean, we have to care in a practical sense because oftentimes these jurists, these Supreme Court justices, allow their personal beliefs and opinions and so forth to cloud their judgment. This is routinely where Sonia Sotomayor, Ketanji Brown Jackson, and Elena Kagan live. They are effectively leftists on the Supreme Court who have justified using their position to further the leftist agenda, regardless of what the law says in many cases. But anyway, but there are three on the court that we can absolutely count on to interpret the Constitution and apply it to the best of their ability according to how it was originally intended, what the original intent of the framers were, what the original intent of the people who wrote laws were, what the original intent was of the people who passed constitutional amendments, what those things were intended to do, how they were intended and commonly understood at the time of passage and so forth. There are three on the court, and sometimes they disagree. Not typically, but sometimes they disagree. But Alito, Thomas, and now Neil Gorsuch, I'm comfortable saying he's been on a few years, and he's constantly on the side of these reliable, originalist justices that I'm thankful for. But we've got five. We've got three that we can never count on. We've got 2.5, Amy Coney Barrett, John Roberts, and Brett Kavanaugh. John Roberts we can rarely count on. The other two newer justices, Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, we can't rely upon them. We don't have enough information to say definitively, but it's troubling where they've fallen on some of these key votes. But let's go through this. And let's talk specifically. I mentioned this already. I'll mention it briefly again. Kavanaugh. Let's just talk about Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh agreed that Trump's executive order could not be enforced, but he wrote a separate opinion, and he said that it was existing federal law, existing federal statutes that independently require birthright citizenship. And so he didn't come out and say that this was a direct violation of the 14th Amendment. That is important, though for this particular executive order, it resulted in the same thing. So, and of course, the three that dissented, Alito, Thomas, and Gorsuch, we'll talk about why they dissented and why the majority ruled what it ruled. And we'll get to that, my friends, here as the program comes together. I'm going to take a little mini break here, a little breather. There's a lot of confusion out there about kratom. You've probably heard the headlines, and most of those headlines, most of the bad headlines, are based upon synthetic garbage that isn't real kratom at all. Real kratom is natural. Real kratom is tested. Real kratom is handled with care, and that's exactly what you get from Christopher's Organic Botanicals. They are a family-run company. They partner directly with farmers in Indonesia. Every batch is tested. There's no chemicals. There are no fillers. There are no shortcuts. This is a trusted herbal option that has been used for generations, and it is a real alternative for people looking for something that doesn't come with a warning label that is a mile long as a CVS receipt, my friends. So you can start with their Kratom Starter Pack. Coupon code TODHUF will save you 10% off your first order. Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com. That's the website, Christopher'sOrganicBotanicals.com. Truth, tradition, transparency, my friends. Okay, so let's look here at the two, opinions. Let's start with the majority opinion. It was written by Chief Justice John Roberts. There's a few main takeaways that we'll go through here. The first is that the text of the 14th Amendment is broad. So I'm going to read a portion of what the 14th Amendment is as it pertains to birthright citizenship. It says this: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens. So Robert says that the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and this, by the way, is kind of central to this argument. What is meant by that? Because it doesn't just say all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens. It says all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Those words were included for a purpose. They have a meaning. Words mean things. This is something that the left, oftentimes just an activist judges, by the way, fail to comprehend, care about, or understand. Words mean things. There's an idea, a concept that is trying to be communicated here. And what specifically is that? Why include and subject to the jurisdiction thereof? What does that mean? Roberts says that has long been understood to mean that virtually everyone born in the United States of America is subject to U.S. law, with only a few narrow exceptions, historically recognized exceptions. Those would include, by the way, children of foreign diplomats, children of invading enemy forces occupying U.S. territory, which is interesting to bring that up. And then, of course, certain historical circumstances, including sovereign tribal nations before Congress changed the law. So Roberts says that it includes everybody if you're here, with the exception of those things that I mentioned. So the court ultimately said that children born to undocumented, illegal aliens, undocumented immigrants, as many publications will have out there as the lingo, or parents on temporary visas do not fall within those exceptions. That's his conclusion. I strongly disagree with that. So does the minority of the court, Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch. But there's a second point that I'm going to get to, and I'll try to get this in before the break. Second point in Roberts' majority opinion is that history overwhelmingly supports that interpretation. There was a Supreme Court case in 1898. It was the United States versus Wong Kim Ark, and it concluded in that case a child born in San Francisco to Chinese parents who were not U.S. citizens, that child was determined to be a U.S. citizen. The majority of the court, the people who signed on to this particular opinion, said that decision established the constitutional rule more than 125 years ago. It has been consistently relied upon since that point in time, and the court rejected the argument that Wong Kim Ark applies only to children of lawful permanent residents. Now, I'm going to pause there. I'm going to go through the two other points in this majority opinion that I want to hit on. We're going to talk about the dissenting opinion, and then we're going to talk a little bit, time permitting, about the Supreme Court's ruling on the states, individual states' abilities and rights to regulate what high school sports looks like, limiting students based upon gender and so forth. And we'll talk about those things after this break, my friends. Sit tight, though. You're listening here to Conservative Not Bitter Talk. I'm your host, Todd Huff. Back in just a minute. Welcome back, my friends. So, continuing our discussion here about the Supreme Court's Birthright citizenship case. We're going through that. I've talked about the two issues at the beginning. I guess two of the four main points in this Birthright citizenship case. We talked about those at the end of last segment. Let's hit on the other two in the majority's opinion. Again, I strongly disagree with this decision, but it has been ruled by the Supreme Court. Birthright citizenship applies to people even if they were not supposed to be here. It is a wild interpretation. It makes little to no sense to me, but yet that's the conclusion, that's the decision of the Supreme Court. So the third point in the majority's opinion is that the executive branch cannot rewrite the Constitution. Obviously, that's the case. That is not what any of us wants to do. The question is, how should that Constitution have been interpreted? But again, if you look at the Roberts opinion, Roberts emphasized that even if a president believes the current interpretation is a mistake, an executive order cannot redefine the meaning of a constitutional provision. But that's not, listen, no one's disputing that. What's being disputed is what the court's actual position is, what it's determined the Constitution means practically, because this question needs to be answered, especially in an era of anchor babies, of birth tourism here in the United States. By the way, there's already There's already consequences of this. In fact, if you look, I was looking on the Bongino report earlier today as I was getting ready for show prep. There's an article out here. This is at the Epoch Times. Justice Department to prioritize birth tourism probes after Supreme Court ruling. So the Justice Department's already taking steps to put limitations on people who might be trying to exploit this decision by the Supreme Court, which, by the way, is atrocious. So we'll go through it, though. But Roberts is saying, look, the president can't rewrite the Constitution just with an executive order. Of course he cannot do that. But by writing the executive order and by getting this before the Supreme Court, he made them make a determining decision. And it's the wrong decision, but nonetheless, it now defines what the 14th Amendment is. It's not just using vague. You'll see that the Wong Kim Ark case from 1898, there's some reasons that it was unclear what this meant in some specific instances that we face today. So I kind of dismissed the third point of Roberts' argument here. But fourth is citizenship is a fundamental constitutional guarantee. So Roberts wrote this: citizenship was the right to have rights. Now that's interesting. That's a very interesting concept because I don't think that I agree with that. You know, citizenship, so our rights come from our Creator. So being born is the right to have rights. Citizenship is the right to say that I'm a citizen, a member of this country's society, and that government is going to ensure my rights. So I don't agree with the whole citizenship was the right to have rights. That's not the correct way of looking at this. All of us have rights. That's the point of the Declaration of Independence. The point of the Declaration of Independence was to say, hey, that our rights come from our Creator. The King of England was interfering with those rights, and so we're not going to play this game anymore, being under his heavy hand, under his thumb. That's the point of the Declaration, which again will be signed 250 years ago coming up this weekend. So, but citizenship is a fundamental constitutional guarantee. That's what Roberts says. He explained in his opinion that the 14th Amendment was designed to establish a clear constitutional rule so that citizenship could not depend on changing political preference or government discretion. So, to summarize, the majority of the Supreme Court, 6-3, and it's concluded that the Constitution, 5-4 concluded that the Constitution, its text, its history, and longstanding Supreme Court precedent all established that nearly everyone born on U.S. soil is automatically a citizen. The wild card there, of course, is Kavanaugh. We talked about him. But let's look here at the dissent. The dissent, of course, written here by Justice Clarence Thomas. And I love Justice Clarence Thomas. I know many on the left don't understand that because Justice Clarence Thomas, since all they want to talk about is race, Justice Clarence Thomas is black. And so they can't understand how a conservative, a white conservative, likes a black jurist on the Supreme Court justice, because Clarence Thomas has his stuff together. This is a man who understands liberty. This is a man who is a fantastic Supreme Court justice. And I'll tell you, listen, I went as a student, this is 27 years ago now. I remember we heard oral arguments in the U.S. Supreme Court, and I wasn't prepared. I didn't know that Clarence Thomas, I'm not going to do it on the camera here because it won't be a good angle, but when Clarence Thomas listens to oral arguments at the Supreme Court, he tilts his head back, looks directly up at the ceiling, and he closes his eyes. And he says he does this so that he can focus on the words that are being said. I find myself doing that sometimes when I'm listening to certain things. It allows me to focus. It blocks out any other distractions. I'm not looking and being persuaded by anything besides just the logic of what I'm listening to. As I was saying those words, I even had my eyes closed. But the point here is when I first saw him, I thought he I thought he had fallen asleep. I'm not lying. This is 27 years ago, and I was just learning about the court and some of the justices and so forth. But he's a fantastic justice. Absolutely incredible American. So his dissent also has 4 main points. Number 1, the 14th Amendment was never intended to grant citizenship to everyone born on U.S. soil. That is the right, or that is, he's exactly right. That phrase, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, means something. And Thomas argues it means something much more limited, much more limited in how people understood it when that was written in 1868 than the majority of the court accepted today. He said it required more than simply being physically present in the United States. I mean, just from a common sense perspective, that is obviously the correct way of looking at it. There is no way that the people who framed that amendment in 1868 meant for this amendment to apply to people, for birthright citizenship to apply to people who snuck past the country's defenses. There's no way that that was how this was interpreted to be. They certainly would have given Congress the right to regulate the people who can come and go in this country. So that's the first point. Number 2, domicile matters. Justice Thomas argued that the historical evidence shows the citizenship clause in the 14th Amendment was understood to cover children whose parents had established a permanent home. This matters, a domicile in the United States. This is not children of people who were merely visiting or present temporarily or unlawfully. He relied heavily on 19th century legal treatises and historical commentary to support that interpretation. Again, this goes without saying, I think. And even Roberts in his majority opinion said that this did not apply. Birthright citizenship did not apply to children of ambassadors and so forth. But why? Why doesn't it? Explain that particular point. Because it matters if the parents have a permanent home here. He also addressed, Thomas did, in his dissenting opinion, talking about the decision, again, in that U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark case from 1898. He said that's been read too broadly for over a century. He said that the Wong Kim Ark case found that the parents, well, in that particular case, the parents were here lawfully, and they were permanent, hear me say this, they were permanent residents. They were domiciled. They had a home here. They were permanent residents. They weren't going anywhere. Their child was then determined to be a U.S. citizen. In Thomas's view, the case did not decide the status of children born to parents here who here legally or only temporarily. He's right again on this, my friends. And I'm out of time here. Got to wrap up this segment. Friends, here's a question for you. Do you know where your money goes after you spend it? If that answer makes you cringe or question it, it's time to check out Freedom Marketplace. We built this platform to connect conservatives like you with businesses that share your values, businesses that refuse to support leftist candidates and leftist causes. It's free for you to use. There's no login that's required. It's all about keeping your dollars aligned with your principles. Visit freedommarketplace.net today. That's freedommarketplace.net. Liberty and business for all, my friends. Quick time out here on my end. You're listening to Conservative Not Bitter Talk. I am your host, Todd Huff. Back here, my friends, in mere minutes. Welcome back, my friends. The final segment of today's program. Time flies, of course, when you are having fun. Maybe you've reached that stage where managing your money feels like juggling more than just numbers. There's tax planning, estate work, investment choices. There's a whole lot more. That's when Family Office Services can really make a difference. Full Suite Wealth brings all those pieces together into one cohesive strategy. Their Family Office Services give you access to a coordinated team with advanced options strategies, private equity, private credit, and legal expertise, all under one roof. It's about simplifying your financial life, planning for the future, making sure your legacy stays strong for generations. Ready for that next level of support? Visit fullsuitewealth.com today. That's fullsuitewealth.com. Build your legacy, secure your future. Okay, the other thing I want to get to, we're going to move past the Supreme Court's Birthright citizenship case. We're going to talk about another case that was released yesterday as well. This was a case involving, transgender athletes in high school sports. So the court ruled yesterday, 6-3, correctly on this one, that states may constitutionally restrict participation in girls' and women's schools sports based on biological sex. This is a win for common sense. This is a win for science. This is a win for girls' sports. This is a win for people who just understand basic biological truth. The court was unanimous on one important point, that these state laws do not violate Title IX, the federal law prohibiting sex discrimination in education. And so there were two cases that were heard together, Little versus Hecox and West Virginia versus BPJ. Both of those cases involved girls, transgender girls. Now I'm going to say something. I know, listen, we have people who listen to this program across different demographics and different, people who are younger, people who are, just all across the spectrum. People who are more seasoned citizens, as Rush used to say, on the other end of the spectrum. And so some of you, this is so new and foreign to this whole transgender thing is messed up. And and it is messed up, by the way. And I don't mean to be harmful to someone who has struggles with these issues. I think that we should be try to help people who have issues where they struggle with these things. Doesn't mean that you have to relate to the struggle. It doesn't mean that you have to justify the perspective to say that it's human to want to help people who have this confusion in their life. But I'm going to say something that's going to upset some people. I don't mean it to be upsetting. I truly mean it to be helpful. Because I remember when I was first reading about transgender girls and all this sort of stuff, it was confusing to me. Because, you heard people say things like, men can have babies. And you say, no, they can't. Well, that's because they say transgender men are men, is what the radical left says. They're not men. That's why they put the word trans in front of them, of the term man, or transgender girls are girls. They're not girls. This is a biological fact. This is not hate speech. This is not meant to be disrespectful to anyone or anything like that. The word trans, listen, I know it's going to upset some people, but I don't really care. It's helpful and it's true. Trans means fake in this instance. So if it's confusing to you, trans girls, trans boys, just read the word as trans. And if you see fake, meaning not biologically, it's not biological what follows. That's what that means. So both of these cases involved transgender girls, or you could say biological boys, challenging state laws that required participation on sports teams to be based on their biological sex. The court ruled 6-3 that the states can absolutely protect female athletic competition. I just have a minute or so left here. The court held that states may conclude that separating sports based on biological sex promotes fair competition, equal athletic opportunities for girls and women. The objectives that led to the creation of girls and women's sports those are the objectives in the first place, right? Why have girls sports if it's not really girls sports? States can absolutely do this. Biological sex is an objective, hear me say this for the people in the back, an objective classification. The majority in this opinion, 6-3 case written by Kavanaugh, the majority emphasized that states are permitted to distinguish between biological males and biological females for athletic competition because of physical differences. I mean, it's good to hear this sort of logic and sense being spoken about in the United States Supreme Court. It is good to read these words. There's more to this ruling, but candidly, I don't have the time to do it because I'm at the end of this third and final segment here today. So, the court rejected the idea that the Constitution requires a case-by-case assessment and held that state legislatures can adopt categorical rules. Good. This is a victory for common sense, for science, for girls' sports, and the like. And I'm out of time, my friends. Thank you so much for tuning in today. It's been a pleasure to be here. I hope you have a great day. SDG.